His head felt like it was splitting. James opened his eyes from the daze. Before him were the low adobe beams, a ceiling pasted with old newspapers, and that familiar air reeking of mold and earth. He froze. Wasn't this the dilapidated tiled house he had lived in for 30 years? He clearly remembered collapsing in the small woods behind the village, clutching half a bottle of cheap liquor, breathing his last amidst regret and loneliness. Before dying, his mind was filled with Grace's tearful face as she held their daughter, and the car accident that he would regret for the rest of his life. Grace, Daisy. He sat up abruptly, his chest heaving violently, cold sweat streaming down his temples. The room was dimly lit, and the calendar on the wall boldly read, April 1986. James raised his hand and stared at it for a long time. The knuckles were strong, the skin taut. There were no age spots, no trembling. He touched his face, no wrinkles, the muscles firm. 30 years. He looked down at this excessively young body, feeling almost unaccustomed to it, as if he were wearing an ill-fitting new garment. He was reborn. A sudden jolt made him remember something. Today was the very day from his past life. He had gotten dead drunk and listened to Widow Lydia's instigation, who claimed that Grace was cheating on him at her mother's house and that Daisy wasn't his child at all. He had rushed home like a madman, beating and cursing Grace, and drove her out of the house. Grace had left in tears, holding Daisy, and on the road, they were hit by an out-of-control tractor, killing both mother and daughter on the spot. Later, he learned that Widow Lydia had been jealous of Grace's beauty, and Victor had been stirring things up behind the scenes. But it was all too late. He had lived in a daze for 30 years, alone, tormented by endless nightmares. No! James suddenly threw off the quilt and rushed out of the room barefoot. The courtyard was empty, and his heart gave a jolt. Grace! A faint sound came from the kitchen. James took the stairs in twos, lifted the fabric curtain, and immediately saw Grace squatting by the stove, tending the fire. She wore a faded floral shirt, her hair simply tied back, her delicate profile flushed by the glow of the fire. Hearing the noise, she trembled all over and instinctively shrank back. James felt as if his heart were being gripped. She was always this terrified whenever she saw him. You? What's wrong? Grace raised her head, her eyes filled with panic. She couldn't speak. A childhood fright had damaged her mind, leaving her mute. After marrying him, she lived in constant fear, and her condition had grown increasingly severe. James suppressed the bitterness in his heart. It's all right. Where's Daisy? Grace paused for a moment, then pointed inside. James turned and entered the room. 3-year-old Daisy was huddled in the corner of the Kong, clutching a rag doll, her small face full of fear. Dad! The little one murmured. James crouched down. Come here, let Dad hold you. Daisy shrank back even tighter. In his past life, he would curse when drunk and shout when annoyed. She had never been close to him. Daisy, Dad was wrong. His voice was hoarse. Dad wasn't human before. From now on, Dad will cherish you. Okay? Daisy blinked her eyes. James gently picked her up, and the little one was stiff all over. Holding her, he whispered, Dad swears, in this life, no one will bully you and Mom. Grace didn't know when she had appeared at the door, staring blankly at him, her eyes filled with confusion. She couldn't understand. Yesterday he had scolded and beaten her, so why was he like a different person today? James walked over holding Daisy in his arms. Grace, don't be afraid. I will never hit you again. Grace lowered her eyes, expressionless. She didn't believe him. He had said too many cruel words over the years, and she had long since learned not to have hope. James understood, but he was in no rush. Daisy is hungry. I'll go make some porridge. You rest. He turned and went into the kitchen. Grace stood where she was, watching him clumsily start the fire and wash the rice at the stove, a surge of indescribable emotions welling up in her heart. Breakfast was watery porridge with pickles. James fed Daisy spoonful by spoonful. The little one only dared to open her mouth when she saw he wasn't looking fierce. Grace sat to one side with her head lowered. Grace, you should eat more. James added a spoonful of porridge to her bowl. Grace's shoulders trembled slightly. She glanced up at him, then lowered her head again. But James noticed that the hand holding the bowl wasn't shaking as badly. I'm not going out today. Whatever work needs doing around the house, I'll help you. Grace froze. He was willing to work? In the past, he had been idle, drinking and gambling all day long, leaving all the housework to her. Even during her pregnancy, she had worked in the fields with a heavy belly, and he hadn't even spared her a glance. James didn't explain. He stood up and went into the yard to chop wood. Grace stood in the doorway as sunlight fell on his broad shoulders. She suddenly felt that the sunlight today seemed different from usual. That day, James didn't go out drinking or gambling. He chopped wood, carried water, and patched the roof, doing all the chores around the house. In the evening, he sat in the yard, watching Grace busy in the kitchen. A long-lost warmth surged in his heart. This was his home. He had destroyed it with his own hands in his past life, and in this life he would protect it with his life. He squatted in front of the stove. Let me help you tend the fire. Grace stepped half a step aside, but he saw it. The fear in her eyes was a little less than it had been that morning. James has changed, the whole village is talking about it. The good-for-nothing layabout who used to drink and brawl seems to have become a different person overnight. He gets up early to work in the fields, comes back and cooks on his own initiative, chops firewood and carries water, and keeps the house spotless. He hasn't been to the village store since, and he hasn't shown his face at the gambling dens even once. Did James take the wrong medicine or something? Martha muttered at the village entrance, cracking sunflower seeds. Who knows? Widow Lydia pursed her lips, a shadow flickering in her eyes. Probably just putting on an act again. She felt a bit flustered. Yesterday she had just spoken ill of Grace to James, intending to make him beat Grace again and drive her back to her parents' home. But to her surprise, he not only didn't get angry, but treated Grace even better. James was unaware of these discussions. Right now, his mind was focused on just one thing: making money. Having muddled through his past life and missed the opportunities of the 1980s, he was determined to seize the chance in this life to give Grace and Daisy a good life. James was unaware of these discussions. Right now, his mind was focused on just one thing: making money. Having muddled through his past life and missed the opportunities of the 1980s, he was determined to seize the chance in this life to give Grace and Daisy a good life. Dad, what are you thinking about? Daisy asked him, looking up with her little face. James crouched down. Dad is thinking about how to make money, so he can buy you tasty treats and new clothes. Daisy's eyes lit up. Dad, I want candy. James felt a lump in his throat. He had never bought his daughter candy before. In the past, she would even get scolded for asking for a bite to eat. Okay. Dad will buy some for you tomorrow. In the evening, when Grace returned from the fields, she saw James chopping wood in the yard. You're back? Are you tired? Rest a while, I'll go cook. Grace paused for a moment, then gently shook her head. Over the years, she had long grown accustomed to hard labor, but looking at his busy back, an indescribable feeling surged in her heart. Grace, I heard there's an old doctor of traditional Chinese medicine in town who is quite good at treating aphasia. I want to take you to see him. Grace froze. She hadn't expected him to care about her illness. In the past, he would only curse her for being a mute and call her a burden. She fell silent for a while, then slowly raised her hand, first pointing at her own throat, then pointing at him before tilting her head, with a question in her eyes. She was asking, do you really want to treat me? James understood and nodded earnestly. I wronged you in the past, and I want to make it up to you properly. Grace lowered her eyes and said nothing. Over the years, she had long since given up hope, but now that hope was right in front of her, she didn't know whether she should believe it. James wasn't in a rush. Take your time to think. Whenever you're willing to go, I'll be with you. Grace's eyelashes trembled. She didn't nod or shake her head, but James noticed that she didn't pull away from his touch immediately like she used to. After Daisy fell asleep that night, James and Grace sat on the Kong, keeping some distance between them. Grace, he began. I did many wrong things in the past. You don't trust me now, but I will prove it with my actions. Take your time. I will always wait for you. Grace didn't look up, but James saw her hands hanging by her side clenched slightly. Early the next morning, James took Grace and Daisy to town. The dirt road was full of potholes, so he borrowed a neighbor's old bicycle, letting Grace sit on the back seat and Daisy on the front crossbar. When they came across large holes, he got off and pushed, the back of his shirt soaked with sweat. Grace sat on the back watching his back, feeling as if something inside her had been gently struck. The town's old doctor of traditional Chinese medicine was over 70. After examining Grace carefully, he said, "This illness is rooted in the heart. A childhood fright injured her spirit, and living in constant fear all these years has tightened the knot in her heart. Medicine can only regulate her body. Opening her voice requires a remedy for the heart. She must feel that this home is safe and that she no longer needs to be afraid." James took those words to heart. On the way back, he rode very steadily. "Grace, I will heal you." Grace didn't look up, but James could feel her lightly gripping the hem of his shirt, ever so gently, like a snail tentatively extending its feelers. It was nearly dark by the time they got back to the village. James pushed the cart into the yard, and looking up, he saw a tall figure standing at the gate. Victor, a notorious thug in the village who loafed around and had coveted Grace for a long time. In his past life, it was Victor who schemed behind the scenes, sending Grace and Daisy down that path to their deaths. "James, heard you've turned over a new leaf?" Victor grinned, his eyes settling on Grace. "Still keeping this mute wife of yours? Why not let me have her? I'll give you $50. James stepped in front of Grace. "Get lost." Victor paused for a moment. In the past, James would always back down and never dared to stand up to him. "Grown a backbone?" he sneered, moving closer. "What's the point of being dirt poor and guarding a mute?" James clenched his fists. "I'll say it one more time. Get lost." Victor was intimidated by his aura and took half a step back. Today, James's gaze was sharp, and his whole body exuded a dangerous air. "Just you wait." Victor threw down a harsh threat and turned to leave, but at the courtyard gate, he looked back. "Little mute, sooner or later you'll be mine." James's fist slammed against the doorframe, startling Victor so much he scurried away. "Grace, don't be afraid." James turned to look at Grace's pale face. "With me here, he won't dare do anything to you." Grace looked at him, eyes slightly red. Over the years, Victor had harassed her no few times. Every time she could only hide and endure. No one had ever protected her. Now with James standing in front of her, she felt something slowly melting inside her. Victor wouldn't let this go. James sat in the courtyard calculating. Beating him up wasn't realistic. It would only make him hold a grudge. The only way was to make money and gain strength so that people like him wouldn't dare have any crooked thoughts again. The next day, James went into town. He strolled around and discovered an out-of-town peddler selling electronic watches. The latest electronic watches. No winding. They keep time automatically. 20 apiece. James's eyes lit up. Electronic watches were becoming popular in the city, but they were still rare in the countryside. He went over to chat with the peddler and got a lead on where to get stock. Back in the village, Grace stood at the door waiting for him. Only when she saw him return did the anxiety in her eyes fade. "I found a business opportunity. I'll go to the city in a couple of days to stock up. I should be able to make a profit." A flicker of worry crossed Grace's eyes. James smiled. "Don't worry, I'm confident." 2 days later, James headed to the city with his savings. He found a supplier, a shrewd man from Guangdong. While inspecting the goods, James discovered that half of them didn't keep time accurately. "There's a problem with this batch. I can't take them." The supplier's expression changed. "Kid, the goods have already been shipped, and you don't want them?" Having weathered society for 30 years in his past life, James kept a stern face. "Either you give me a good batch or you refund me. Otherwise, I'll report you to the Industry and Commerce Bureau for selling fakes." The supplier stared at him for a long while before reluctantly changing the goods. James broke out in a cold sweat. One slip and his capital would have been completely lost. Back in town, he set up a stall, but at first no one bought anything. The villagers were conservative and didn't trust new gadgets. James stood by his stall every day, patiently explaining the benefits of digital watches. They kept accurate time, didn't need winding, and were affordable. Slowly, people started buying. The 100 watches he brought in half a month sold out, netting him over 100 yuan, about what an ordinary person earned in a year. Back in the village, he handed the money to Grace. "You keep this. From now on, you call the shots on family matters." Looking at the stack of money in her hands, Grace's eyes grew slightly red. In the past, James had spent his money on drinking or gambling, never thinking of the family. Now he was giving the money to her and saying that she was in charge of family affairs. She put down the money and made a gesture, first pointing at him, then at her own heart, and then putting her hands together and parting them in the middle, making a flipping over motion. She was saying, "You have really changed." James felt a tightness in his throat. "I will stay this way. I will never let you suffer again in this lifetime." Grace lowered her eyes and nodded. Time moved forward, and James's business grew smoother and smoother. After dealing with electronic watches, he moved on to trading clothing and small home appliances. He was exceptionally careful when stocking up, inspecting the goods 3 times every time, and gradually gained a reputation among suppliers as someone not easy to fool. Daisy became increasingly clingy with him, waiting at the door every evening for her dad to come home. But trouble also arrived. Someone wrote an anonymous letter to the town authorities accusing him of speculation and profiteering. On the day the officials came to investigate, Grace saw several people wearing Mao suits enter the courtyard and was so frightened that she hid inside the room, trembling. James spread out his ledger with every entry recorded clearly, along with tax receipts. The officials looked it over and nodded. "Legitimate business, no problem. It's a good thing that you are leading the way to prosperity." After the cadre left, James entered the room and saw Grace sitting by the edge of the Kong, her shoulders trembling. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with terror. The same look she had given him on the first day of his rebirth. He softened his voice. "It's all right. It's been taken care of. It was just people from town coming to understand the situation." Grace slowly relaxed. James sat down beside her without touching her. "Grace, I sometimes run into trouble with my business, but I'll handle it. You don't need to worry too much." Grace looked at him for a long time, then nodded gently. That night, James lay in bed thinking a lot. He realized that since his rebirth, he had hardly made any mistakes, like a perfect machine. But he knew that deep down he still had some flaws: a quick temper, concern for face, and sometimes an inability to control his emotions. He told himself that he didn't need to pretend to be a perfect person, but he had to keep himself in check. Summer arrived, and James renovated their adobe house into a brick house. On the day the new house was completed, Daisy was so happy that she ran back and forth in the yard. Grace also made progress with her vocal exercises, going from indistinct breathy sounds to being able to utter single syllables like ah and oh. Every time James returned from packing up his stall, he would practice with her for a while, but she knew clearly in her heart, she was the one who truly wanted to speak. She had kept too many words bottled up over the years. She wanted to say "Mom loves you" to Daisy herself, and say "thank you" to James herself. However, beneath the surface calm, the widow Lydia was plotting again in secret. Hearing that James's business was getting better and better, the jealousy in her heart burned even more fiercely. Why should that mute woman get to enjoy the good life? Why was Grace, whom she used to trample underfoot, now wearing new clothes and living in a new house? She began secretly spreading another story around the village, saying that the money James made in business was dirty and of dubious origin, saying that Grace had been loose back in her maiden home, and that Daisy's parentage was questionable. These rumors were passed around during tea and after dinner. Although most people were half skeptical, there were always those who would gossip. One day, a few women from the village were washing clothes by the well, and Lydia was stirring up trouble again. "James has made it big now, who knows, he might dump his mute wife any day." Look at him running to town every day. There's no telling if he has someone out there. Grace happened to be passing by and stopped in her tracks. She gripped the bucket in her hand, turned around and walked to the well. She couldn't speak, but she could write. She took out the paper and pen she always carried with her, wrote a few lines and handed them over. James treats me very well. He has never said he would dump me. If you say such things again, I will go to the village head. The women were stunned. Lydia flushed, but argued stubbornly. Who can't write a few words? If you've got the guts, confront me to my face. But the confidence in her eyes was clearly gone. Grace put away her paper and pen and turned to leave, her hands still trembling slightly, but her back held very straight. James returned from town in the evening, and Martha came bustling over to recount the whole thing. Your wife was really tough today. She left Lydia completely speechless. James walked into the house, where Grace was cooking at the stove. He stood behind her, silent for a long while. Grace glanced back at him, likely guessing what Martha had said, and her face flushed slightly. Grace. James's voice was a little tight. You were amazing today. Grace lowered her eyes, but the corners of her mouth curled up. She wouldn't say, I was protecting you, but she knew why she did it, because this man was worth protecting. From that day on, Grace practiced her vocal exercises with even more enthusiasm. Before, it was James urging her to practice. Now she urged herself. Every day she got up early to practice in front of the window, and before going to sleep she would scribble on paper. Sometimes James would wake up in the middle of the night and hear her making indistinct sounds next door, as if she were trying to vomit out 30 years of silence. But she was stuck on the two-syllable step. She could produce single sounds. Ah, oh, were all fine. But when two characters were linked together, they became indistinct. After practicing for several days without progress, she began to get impatient, and once threw the paper and pen onto the Kong. James walked over and squatted in front of her. Why the rush? A few months ago you couldn't say a single word, and now being able to produce single sounds is already a miracle. Grace looked at him, tears swirling in her eyes. Her lips moved, and after a long while she uttered two indistinct syllables. Ank. You. The voice was soft and indistinct, but James understood. He nodded, his throat feeling as if something were stuck in it. You're welcome. Take your time. That night, Grace practiced until late before going to sleep. James lay in bed listening to the sounds from next door. She was practicing the character Chun over and over again, like a clumsy bird trying to spread its wings. He closed his eyes, feeling that he had never been so at peace in his entire life. However, after being snubbed at the well, Lydia did not restrain herself. She lay low for a few days on the surface, but secretly she went to find Victor. The two met in the dilapidated temple behind the village, and Lydia lowered her voice. Don't you want to put James in his place? He's riding high right now. If we don't suppress him soon, there really won't be any place left for either of us to have a say in this village. Victor held his cigarette between his teeth. You have an idea? I heard James is going to the city next month to pick up a big shipment, and he's taking cash with him. Lydia narrowed her eyes. You find some people to wait on the road, rob the goods, and break his legs. He's just a businessman. Who's going to care if something happens to him? Besides, if he ends up crippled or paralyzed, that mute woman, won't she be yours to deal with? Victor's eyes lit up when he heard this. He patted Lydia on the shoulder. You woman, you really have a vicious heart, but I like it. In early October, James was indeed going to the city to stock up. This time it was a batch of autumn and winter clothing. He had saved up capital for nearly half a year, over 800 yuan in all, tucked into his inside pocket. On the day of his departure, Grace stood at the door to see him off, anxiety in her eyes. I'll be back in 2 days. James mounted his bicycle and waved. Make sure to lock the door at home. It was over 40 li to the city, and a stretch of it was a desolate dirt road flanked by dense poplar forests. When James rode onto that stretch, a vague sense of alertness arose in his heart. Having lived over 60 years in his past life, he still possessed that much intuition. He slowed down and carefully observed his surroundings. Sure enough, a figure was moving deep within the woods. James's heart skipped a beat, and he squeezed the brakes hard. Almost simultaneously, 3 wooden sticks swept out from behind the trees, and he tumbled into the ditch by the roadside, bike and all. "That's him. Get him." It was Victor's voice. James ignored the pain and rolled away. The 3 were Victor and his 2 lackeys, carrying clubs and looking fierce. Victor walked over with a sinister sneer. "James, it's just not your day, running into me. Hand over the money, and I'll go easy on you." James stood up gasping for air, his back burning with pain. He glanced around, 3 of them all armed, while he was empty-handed. He couldn't escape, and fighting head-on would put him at a disadvantage. His mind raced, and suddenly he shouted toward the edge of the woods. "Help! Robbery! Help!" Victor was startled and instinctively looked back. Seizing the moment, James lunged forward, grabbed the wooden club from Victor's hand, and drove his knee hard into Victor's abdomen. Victor let out a muffled groan and doubled over. The other 2 froze for a second. By then, James had already snatched the club and held it across his body. "Come on." A cold sneer curled the corner of his mouth. "Who's first?" The 2 exchanged a glance. Usually, they were fine with bullying honest folks, but when they met someone tough, they chickened out. Victor clutched his stomach, crouched on the ground, and cursed. "Useless. Get him together." But James wasn't giving them any more chances. He swung his wooden club and struck the man on the left on the shoulder. The man cried out and dropped his club. The one on the right was so scared he turned and ran. James didn't give chase, looking down at Victor. "You've got some nerve, robbing people in broad daylight. You're coming with me to the police station." Victor's face changed. "James, you? Let me off this time. I won't trouble you again." "You said that last time too." James grabbed him by the collar. "Don't think you can fool me this time." He dragged Victor to the town police station, and the 2 accomplices who had run away were also brought back the next day. James postponed his restocking trip by 3 days to cooperate with the police in giving statements. Victor was detained for 2 months for attempted robbery, while the 2 accomplices were each detained for 1 month. The news spread back to the village and caused an uproar. When the widow Lydia heard that Victor had been arrested, her face turned deathly pale. She hid in her house for 2 days, afraid to go out, terrified that someone might implicate her. Fortunately, the 2 accomplices kept their mouths shut and didn't mention her, so she finally breathed a sigh of relief. But from then on, she would steer clear of James's family and never dared to gossip in the village again. Only after dealing with these matters did James find the time to go to the city to restock. The clothing sold well, and he made over 400 yuan in a single winter. Before winter set in, he hired a mason to raise and reinforce the courtyard walls, and replaced the lock on the gate with a larger iron one. "Keep the door locked from now on," he told Grace. "Call me if you need anything. I'm here." Grace looked at his palms, which were already calloused, and nodded gently. The last trace of anxiety in her heart vanished. In the 12th lunar month, James's business was booming. He hired 2 young men from the village to help out and had secured a fixed stall at the county seat. But although Victor was locked up, the threats he had released still lingered. Some of the village idlers, though they said nothing openly, were privately extremely envious of James's business. James knew the score. He took the initiative to approach the village head and proposed repairing a stretch of road. The few miles of muddy track from the village entrance to the town were truly difficult to traverse. The village head slapped his thigh. "That's a good thing. The village will provide the labor, and you cover the cost of materials." On the day the road was finished, the whole village came to see it. James stood in the crowd, listening to the fellow villagers praise him for not forgetting his roots after making something of himself. He smiled and didn't say much. He knew that in this village, having money alone wasn't enough. One also had to earn respect. After the road repair incident, no one dared gossip about him behind his back anymore. On the evening of the 23rd day of the 12th lunar month, Little New Year's Eve, James was making dumplings with Grace. After over half a year of spending time together, Grace no longer avoided him. The two sat side by side on the edge of the Kong, one rolling out dough wrappers and the other filling them. Whenever their eyes met, she would blush slightly. "James!" Grace suddenly uttered a muffled sound. She had been practicing her voice more diligently lately, facing the window every day, practicing single syllables over and over again. James looked up. Grace pointed at the fireworks outside the window, then pointed at her own mouth. After holding it in for a while, she finally uttered a clear word, "Flower." Although it was just one word, it was much clearer than her previous muffled whispers. James smiled and nodded. "Yes, flower. Fireworks." The corners of Grace's mouth curled up, and she tried again. "Flower." This time it was even clearer. Daisy lay on the windowsill watching the fireworks, then turned her head and shouted, "Mom! Say another one." Grace's face flushed red. She held it in for a long while, then finally blurted out a single word, "Good." Daisy clapped her hands and jumped up. "Mom can say good." James watched this scene, his heart feeling warm. He lowered his head and continued rolling out the dough, not noticing the look Grace gave him. That gaze held less of the fear from before and more of something tender. But as the year drew to a close, the village grew unsettled again. Although Victor was locked up, his two henchmen had been released. One of them, a fellow named Billy, bore a grudge against James for sending him to jail last time, and every few days he'd grumble over drinks at the village entrance. "What's so special about James? Just a bit of small-time trading, isn't it? Wait till my big brother gets out." Those words reached James's ears. He made no fuss, and the next evening he took 2 bottles of liquor and went to Billy's house. When Billy opened the door and saw it was him, his expression changed. "You? What are you doing here?" James set the wine on the table. "Have a drink, and let's have a chat while we're at it." Billy eyed him warily, but the aroma of the wine was enticing, and he couldn't resist in the end. After downing 3 cups, James spoke. "Billy, I know you're holding a grudge. Last time you followed Victor and did the wrong thing. You can't blame anyone else. But think about it. If you had actually crippled me and stolen the money back then, where would you be now? You'd be spending the new year in jail." Billy hung his head in silence. James added, "I'm expanding the shop this spring and I'm short-handed. If you're willing, come help out at my place. I'll pay you $30 a month. Better than spending all day moping at the village entrance drinking by yourself." Billy was stunned. He stared at his wine cup for a long while, his voice a bit hoarse. You don't hold a grudge against me?" James shook his head. "You did things openly. I respect you as a man. As long as you don't go down the wrong path in the future, we can still get along." Billy downed a bowl of wine, his eyes red as he nodded. The next day, the news spread through the village. Martha clicked her tongue in amazement by the well. "James really knows how to handle things. He won people over without a fuss or a fight. Who would dare go against him now?" Hearing this, Lydia shrank inside her home, not daring to make a sound. She was completely deflated now. Victor was locked up, Billy had sided with James, and there was no one left in the village who stood with her. She even chose to go to the well to wash clothes when few people were around, terrified of running into Grace. On New Year's Eve, Grace made a pot of dumplings. James returned from town with a string of firecrackers and a small bag of candy. Daisy danced around the candy bag. Grace stood before the stove, her back to him, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Grace!" James walked over. She turned around, her eyes red, but with a smile on her face. She took a deep breath, moved her lips for a long time, and finally uttered 2 indistinct syllables. "Hap? Year." Although her voice was hoarse and indistinct, James heard it clearly. He froze for a moment, then smiled. "Happy New Year." "Grace, Happy New Year." Outside the window, firecrackers crackled and popped. Daisy covered her ears, laughing and jumping. Grace stood by the stove, looking at her husband and daughter, and finally let her tears fall. This was the first New Year's Eve since she married into the family that truly felt like the new year. On the first day of the Lunar New Year, James took Grace and Daisy to the village to pay New Year calls. Grace clutched the hem of his shirt all the way there, her palms sweating. She had never dared to go out and see people before, afraid they would mock her for being a mute. "Don't be afraid," James whispered. "If you don't want to speak, just don't. A nod will do." But Grace had a burst of determination inside her. She followed James from house to house, and every time someone greeted her, she tried hard to open her mouth. Although she couldn't utter complete words, she could already respond with single syllables like and ah. The villagers found it remarkable. That mute wife who never made a sound was actually able to make noises now. When they arrived at Martha's house, Martha held Grace's hand and said, "Oh my, you look so much better. James has taken good care of you these past 6 months." Grace's face flushed. She lowered her head, her lips moving slightly. Martha paid it no mind and was about to let go to pour tea when Grace suddenly spoke. 2 words, very soft and hoarse, but perfectly clear. "Ank, you." Martha's hand trembled, and the teapot nearly slipped from her grasp. "Oh my, you can talk." Grace nodded, her eyes growing hot. Several women nearby gathered around, chattering away with their praise. Grace stood in the midst of the crowd, neither shrinking nor hiding away. Though her face was burning red, she held herself straight. James stood at the doorway watching her, a surge of indescribable pride rising in his heart. From that day on, Grace practiced her voice even more frantically. She would get up before dawn every day to practice in the yard, repeating those few words over and over. When her voice grew hoarse, she would drink some water and continue. When her lips cracked, she would apply some lard and keep on practicing. J, she repeated over and over. James. James noticed she was stuck on disyllables. She could manage single syllables. Oh, were all fine, and flower, good, thanks could pop out too. But when 2 characters were strung together, they became indistinct, as if her tongue were tied in a knot. After practicing for several days with no progress, she began to grow impatient. One evening she threw the paper and pen onto the Kong, huddled in the corner, and sobbed, her shoulders trembling. James walked over, squatted in front of her, and said, "Why the rush? 6 months ago you couldn't say a single word, and now you can pop out single characters. Even the neighbors praise you for being amazing." Grace raised her head and looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Her lips moved, and only after a long while did she make a sound. "I want to talk to you." Each word came out one by one, halting and intermittent, but James understood. His throat felt as if something were blocking it. "I know. You've already been amazing. Tell me what you want to say. Take your time. I'm waiting." Grace wiped away her tears and took a deep breath. She stared into James's eyes, her lips trembling, trying again and again. James. The last time, though hoarse, the 2 words connected, clear and distinct. James's tears gushed out. He hugged her tightly. "Grace, you can say my name now." Grace, lying in his arms, also began to cry aloud. She didn't know why she had suddenly found her voice, but she knew it was because of him. The gentleness, patience, and care over the past 6 months had melted the iceberg in her heart bit by bit. She finally believed that this home was safe, and there was no need to be afraid anymore. "James!" She cried out tremblingly, a bit more clearly this time. Daisy ran out from the inner room and saw her mom and dad crying in each other's arms. "Mom, Dad, what's wrong?" James wiped away his tears and squatted down. "Daisy, your mom can speak now." Daisy opened her eyes wide. "Really? Mom, say something." Grace squatted down. Daisy. Daisy froze for a second, then suddenly threw herself into her arms. "Mom, you can speak." Grace held her daughter, and tears flowed down again. That night, James sat by the brick bed, listening to Grace practicing speaking over and over again. James? Thank you. James, you're back. Whenever her throat hurt, she would rest for a while, then continue when she felt better. Listening to her clumsy voice was like listening to the finest melody. On the evening of the 5th day of the Lunar New Year, Grace stood at the doorway waiting for him. As James wheeled his bike into the yard, she took a deep breath. Who? Spanned. Her voice was still soft, but perfectly clear. James's hand froze. She called out again, "Husband." He walked over and took her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "Grace, I have waited a lifetime for you to call me husband." Grace looked up, her eyes shining. "James, I have something to tell you." She paused. "You have been so good to me lately. I have really fallen in love with you." James was on the verge of tears. He said nothing, only held her hand tightly. The red scraps of firecrackers in the yard had not yet been swept away, and Daisy was inside playing with her new candy, while the occasional sound of firecrackers drifted in from the distance. Grace leaned against James's shoulder, listening to the thumping of her own heart, feeling that she had never felt so secure in her entire life. When spring arrived, the peach tree in the yard blossomed, its pink and white petals covering the ground. Grace spoke more and more fluently. Although she still stuttered occasionally, she could now greet neighbors, chat with Daisy, and talk to James about everyday matters. She spoke more with each passing day, and her voice grew ever clearer. But what truly surprised James was something else. One day in mid-March, Grace suddenly said, "Honey, I want to learn how to keep the accounts." James was chopping wood in the yard, and the axe in his hand paused. "Learn to keep the accounts? There's more and more to do at the shop, and you can't handle it all on your own," Grace said earnestly. "I'm just idling at home anyway. If I learn, I can help you with the bookkeeping." James looked at her, silent for a long while. He didn't even know when it had started. Grace had gone from a woman who would only cower in the corner in fear to someone who would worry about the business for him. He nodded. "All right, I'll teach you." From that day on, Grace spent her days learning bookkeeping from James. Though she had never been to school, she was bright. After half a month of learning, she could handle the abacus with ease. James taught her to recognize Arabic numerals and simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. She memorized them by day and recited them by night, taking it even more seriously than Daisy took her schoolwork. By May, James had expanded his business from the county seat to the city and had also leased a storefront in town. He hired Billy and 2 other assistants, and they were so busy every day that their feet hardly touched the ground. Sometimes when he returned in the evening, the ledger would be spread out on the table, already sorted out clearly by Grace, which payments were income and which were expenses, who had bought on credit and who had settled up without a single error. "Your mind works better than mine," James laughed as he flipped through the ledger. Grace glared at him. "I was never stupid." Her speech was still a bit halting, but she could already express herself fully. As James's business grew, so did the various trivial matters. Some grew jealous of his success and spread rumors around town that he was selling counterfeit goods. When Grace heard about it, she quietly went to town the next day. She sought out a few regular customers, showed them James's purchase orders and quality inspection seals. "This is my proof of purchase. Every batch is fully documented." She spoke slowly, but her tone was firm. The regular customers looked at the receipts and defended her. "James's sourcing is perfectly transparent. Someone's just jealous and spreading rumors." When James heard about it that evening, he was stunned for a long while. "You went alone?" Grace nodded. He suddenly realized that he didn't know when it had started, but she no longer needed him to stand in front of her. She had learned to move forward on her own. In the autumn, another trouble arose. A thug named Mark in town, who was distantly related to Victor, had always wanted to get back at Victor on his behalf. He kept coming to James's shop to pick fights, now complaining that the prices were too high, now claiming the quality was poor, causing customers to be afraid to even come inside. James didn't confront him head-on. He went to the town official in charge of the market and reported Mark's troublemaking. The official intervened and warned Mark twice, and Mark quieted down for a few days, but he held a grudge. One evening in October, James was packing up his stall to head home. As he passed the alley at the east end of town, Mark blocked his way with 4 other men. "James, let's settle our score today." Mark held a cigarette in his mouth. "My cousin is still sitting in there. You need to give me an explanation." James propped up his bicycle and looked at him calmly. "Your cousin committed robbery by blocking the road. It was the police station who sentenced him. If you want an explanation, go to the police station." Mark spat on the ground. "Don't try to intimidate me with the police station. Either you cough up $500 today, or I'll make you leave here feet first." James didn't speak. He took something out of the bike basket, a palm-sized cassette recorder with the tape still spinning. "I recorded everything you just said." He pressed the stop button. "Want to go to the police station and let the officers have a listen?" Mark's face changed. He hadn't expected James to have kept this trick up his sleeve. The 4 of them looked at each other, and Mark gritted his teeth. "You win." He left dejectedly with his men. James put away the recorder, his back covered in a cold sweat. He had picked it up on a whim when he went to the city to buy stock a while back. He hadn't expected it would actually come in handy. When he got home, he told Grace what had happened. After listening, Grace didn't speak for a long time. After a good while, she suddenly said, "Honey, you've worked so hard." James paused for a moment. Grace walked over and gently took his hand. "First it was Victor, now it's Mark. One after another. You're shouldering it all alone. And it hurts me to watch." James's Adam's apple bobbed. He squeezed her hand back. "It's not hard. As long as you and Daisy are safe, I can handle anything." Grace's eyes reddened. She leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. "From now on, we'll shoulder it together." That winter, James taught Grace how to issue invoices and keep accounts. When the shop was busy, Grace would sit behind the counter, taking payments and making change with a smile on her face. After school, Daisy would do her homework at the shop and help her mom organize stock once she was done. Martha saw the scene of the family of 3 having dinner behind the counter and talked about it for days after she got home. "Tsk. The life James is living is like a painting." Victor was released in the 12th lunar month. He returned to the village only to find that everything had changed. Billy had sided with James, widow Lydia shunned him, and the newly paved road at the village entrance had been paid for by James, so everyone in the village sang his praises. Victor stayed cooped up in his room for 3 days, then packed his bags and left. No one knew where he went and no one cared. Widow Lydia was completely deflated. In the past, relying on Victor's backing, she could still boss people around in the village. Now that Victor had run away and she had offended James's family, no one in the village paid her any mind. She lived alone in the old house at the west end of the village. Even during the holidays, not a single person came to visit. Once, when Grace went to the well to fetch water, Lydia spotted her from a distance and immediately turned to head home. Grace called out to her. Though she still spoke slowly, every word was clear. "Lydia, wait a moment." Lydia froze in her tracks, daring not to look back. Grace walked over to her and looked at her calmly. "I won't hold the past against you anymore. But remember this, James is my man. If anyone dares to scheme after him again, I won't be polite." Lydia's face flushed and then turned pale. She stammered, nodded, and hurried away. Grace stood by the well, watching her retreating figure, and let out a soft breath. She knew she had changed. From the woman who used to cower and tremble behind the stove into someone who could stand up and protect her home. On New Year's Eve, James didn't pack up until the afternoon. He rode his new motorcycle home, and halfway there he saw Grace and Daisy waiting at the village entrance. Grace was wearing the new padded jacket he had bought for her, her hair neatly pinned up, standing in the sunset and smiling at him. "Husband," she called out. Though there was still a slight stutter, her voice was crisp and clear. James stopped the bike. "It's so cold. Why are you standing at the village entrance?" Grace pursed her lips and smiled. "Waiting for you." Daisy bounded over and hugged his waist. "Dad, Mom made dumplings, chive and egg filling." James scooped his daughter up and placed her on the back of the motorcycle. Let's go. Home for dumplings. That spring festival was unusually lively. James invited Billy and his wife over for the New Year's Eve dinner. Martha brought a pot of braised pork, and even a few elderly villagers were invited to sit at a table. After a few rounds of drinks, someone started egging Grace on to say a few words. Grace's face turned completely red. She stood up holding her wine glass and stammered, "Thank you, everyone, for taking care of me before." She still spoke slowly, but she made an effort to pronounce every word clearly. Everyone at the table applauded and cheered. Martha wiped the corner of her eye. "This child, so articulate, how wonderful." James sat next to Grace and gently took her hand under the table. Grace clasped his back, their fingers interlaced. With the arrival of spring, James had new plans. He took over a third shop in town, intending to turn it into the town's first department store. Short of funds for inventory, he worried for several days. Grace dug out the family passbook and calculated the figures for him item by item. "We've saved over $900 this year. Add the cash flow from the shop and borrow a bit from the credit union, and it should be enough." James looked at the dense rows of credits and debits in the passbook, all in Grace's handwriting, feeling a mix of sourness and warmth in his heart. "When did you learn all this?" Grace tilted her head and thought for a moment. "You taught me, of course. And also, I read some books myself." She fished out 2 old books from the cabinet, Basic Accounting and Introduction to Business Management. Their covers curled from wear. "Bought them at a second-hand book stall in town. 50 cents each." James took the book and flipped through it. It was densely marked with lines, along with Grace's crooked annotations. His throat felt a little tight. "Grace, you're more capable than I am." Grace glared at him. "Nonsense. You're the one who holds the family together." In March, the new store opened, and James was so busy he barely touched the ground. Grace volunteered to manage the general ledger for him, and every evening she would hoizong revenues, book entries, and reconcile accounts for all the stores, organizing everything methodically. Daisy also came to help after school, the small figure passing items and making change behind the counter, looking the part. The days moved forward one by one, peaceful and steady. By August, James suddenly noticed something was off with Grace. She had been constantly drowsy lately, couldn't wake up in the mornings, and would frown at the smell of grease. "What's wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" James asked. Grace shook her head, but her face was a bit flushed. 2 days later, she took James to the town's health center. When they returned, Grace was clutching a slip of paper in her hand, the corners of her mouth twitching upward uncontrollably. "What's wrong?" James became anxious. Grace handed the slip to him. Her voice so soft it was as if she were afraid of startling something. "Honey, I'm pregnant." James unfolded the paper and glanced at it, freezing in place. Grace gave him a shove. "Say something. Come on." James snapped back to reality and hugged her tightly. "Really? Grace, really?" Grace nodded in his arms, her eyes welling up. The doctor said, 2 months. James held her, unable to speak for a long time. He thought of the empty home from his past life, of the lonely old man gasping his last breath in the small woods clutching a bottle of liquor, and then he looked at the person in his arms. She was alive, she could speak again, and she was carrying their child. "Let's go home." He took her hand. "Let's go home and tell Daisy." When Daisy came home from school and heard the news, she jumped up with joy. "Really? That's wonderful. I'm going to be a big sister." In the depths of autumn, the osmanthus blossoms filled the courtyard with fragrance. On an early morning in early October, Grace went into labor. James rushed her to the town health center overnight, pacing back and forth outside the delivery room, his palms sweating. Daisy leaned against his legs, looking up and asking, "Dad, does it hurt for Mom?" James squatted down and hugged his daughter. "Mom is very brave. She'll be fine in a little while." Just before daybreak, a loud cry came from the delivery room. The nurse pushed the door open. "Congratulations, it's a boy." 6 pounds and 4 ounces. James rushed in and saw Grace lying weakly on the bed, holding a wrinkled little bundle in her arms. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright. "Honey, look, him." James took the swaddled baby, looking down at the tiny face, his hands trembling. The little one furrowed its brow, cried a few times, then fell quiet, eyes opening a slit, black and bright. Grace smiled weakly. "Give him a name." James thought for a moment. "Name him Owen, safe and sound." Grace smiled. "Okay, let's call him Owen." Daisy leaned over the edge of the bed and carefully stroked her little brother's cheek. "Hello there, little brother. I'm your big sister." James stood by the bed watching the scene. His gaze fell upon Grace's face. She was looking down at the son in her arms, a smile on her lips, her expression soft and gentle. He recalled the version of himself from his past life who had cried his heart out before a grave, that confused old man who lived for 30 years guarding a house full of memories and regret. He walked over and gently held her hand. Grace looked up at him. "What's wrong?" James shook his head, his voice a little hoarse. "Nothing. It's just that this life hasn't been lived in vain." Grace looked at him and smiled softly. She held his hand back, their fingers interlaced. "James, thank you. Thank you for letting me live again." James lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Outside the window, the scent of osmanthus drifted through the air. Daisy was making her little brother laugh, and Grace was leaning on his shoulder. Listening to the children's laughter and his wife's breathing inside the room, James felt an unprecedented sense of peace settle in his heart. He had been reborn for over 3 years now. Grace could speak, Daisy had grown up healthy, and they had a son. Life was getting better and better. All the regrets of his past life had been made up for. He looked at the blooming osmanthus outside the window, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. In this lifetime, he had finally become a complete person. He would continue to live well and love this family deeply. For a lifetime,